Let's talk about homeschool stereotypes. Hi, I'm Rachel from 7 and All, and my idea for this video is kind of more of a fun, light-hearted video. I'll let you get to know me a little bit, and let's chat about homeschool stereotypes. I'm going to be sharing some of the big stereotypes that we often hear about homeschoolers, and I'll be talking about whether I feel like they apply or don't apply in my own personal case as a homeschool graduate and homeschool parent. I'll be talking about that. And feel free in the comments down below, share your own experience. Do you feel that any of these stereotypes genuinely do fit your family, and why or why not? Yeah, let's talk about it. Number one, there's the stereotype of the socially awkward and or introverted homeschooler. And I actually have a lot of thoughts about this stereotype. I'm going to try to keep it very short here, which we should acknowledge that socially awkward and introverted is not identical, but I feel like these ideas are often combined together and wrapped up together. One, it is no better to be extroverted than it is to be introverted. I just have to say that in defense of introverts everywhere. I am definitely introverted myself. I'm very happy in my home, in peace and quiet. I am content with my own company. I don't need other people to be energized. I'm definitely an introvert. But I actually believe that it's okay to be introverted, and I actually believe that the concern or the worry that if you homeschool your kids, they might be socially awkward is really overstated and kind of just weird to me. Like, why would we be so concerned that people just might be socially awkward? Like, is that something we're really, really scared of? Because to me, I would be more concerned of what if my kids in their interactions with other people were inconsiderate? What if they were rude or selfish and self-seeking and didn't consider the needs of other people around them? That's something that would concern me a whole lot more than if they were a little bit socially awkward. I would be concerned with worrying, what if my kids are disrespectful to other people in their neighborhood, in the store, in all of their interactions? That's what I would be concerned about as a parent. I would genuinely not really be concerned if they're a little socially awkward. I kind of think that I actually think extroverts, maybe this is just me as an introvert, I think that extroverts are the people causing all the awkward situations. They're the ones going up to total strangers and just striking up conversations and asking them personal questions. I'm married to an extrovert who was public schooled and who talks to anybody. So that's the perspective I'm coming from on this. I know that there's different ways to be socially awkward, but it would concern me much more to be if your dealings with other people could be characterized as disrespectful or as inconsiderate or self-seeking, selfish. Those things would be more of concerns to me, but socially awkward is not that big of a concern. And as far as how this stereotype applies to me, I would say, yeah, I do tend to be a little bit more quiet in big groups of people or big crowds, especially where I don't maybe feel at home or don't know so many people. In my own crowd, in my own group of people where I do feel comfortable, I'm comfortable. I'm very happy. But I don't necessarily feel that need to always be with people or always be talking and constantly talking to all the strangers in line. I know a lot of extroverts. I have siblings who are total extroverts and have never met a stranger. So there's quite a variety in this aspect, but I just kind of come at this stereotype from the point of, why is this a concern? It feels like there's way more bigger things to be concerned about and to be concerned about teaching our kids. Next, there's often a stereotype that homeschoolers are super nerdy or super smart or just very bookish. Always, books are their favorite thing and their nose is always in a book. That's a stereotype I heard a lot growing up. That's a stereotype that fits me 100%. I am super smart. I am very nerdy. I am very bookish. My childhood dream, along with many of you probably, was to have a library in my own home. And I'm working on achieving that childhood dream. That is a stereotype. I don't see it as a bad thing. I know that not all homeschoolers are nerdy. I think a lot of it just depends on temperament and what you're naturally interested in. All of my siblings, I would say, are very smart in their own ways. We all have different angles. We all have different talents. All of my siblings have a good education. They've all have different relationships with their education, different passions. And some of my siblings would probably almost, as adults, would probably almost never pick up a book just for the fun of it. Meanwhile, I'm like, I could never have enough time to read all the books that I want to read, or enough money to access all the books I want to read. So it's, for me, this stereotype fits very well personally, but obviously not all homeschoolers are going to be super nerdy and want to read books all the time, and even boring nonfiction books. I think they're fun, if they're well written. I love to read on many topics, but not everybody wants to have their nose in a book. Not every homeschooler is following some nerdy passion or another. Many of us are, because this method of education allows us to get excited about learning and get excited about education. So we see nerdy as not being a bad thing at all. Third stereotype I want to talk about is the homeschooling family that is a huge family with a ton of kids. And the family I grew up in, I would say definitely qualifies. I am the oldest of a ton of kids, and at one point in our lives, we did have the 15-passenger van that has become almost indelibly associated with homeschoolers. So yeah, that does fit my particular family that I grew up in. I don't have a ton of kids. Different families end up being different sizes. That's not actually something that's fully in your control, how many kids you get to bring home. But I did grow up with a ton of siblings. We had the 15-passenger van. We never had 15 people in our family, but you really need those extra seats for all your friends, your cousins, all the extra people, because we do have friends, even if we're homeschoolers. Next stereotype is that homeschool kids are really sheltered, and homeschool parents are controlling and sheltering, and the kids don't know much about the outside world. Here's where it's like, yes and no. I don't see age-appropriate sheltering as a bad thing. I don't think our small children need to know every terrible thing that goes on in our world. Yep. I don't see sheltering necessarily as a bad thing, so I don't use that word in a 100% bad way. But I do think that as our kids grow, they should be aware of the world that they live in. They should be engaging in a right and correct way with the world that they live in. So I would say, looking back on my own experience, in some ways, yeah, were we a little sheltered? Probably. Like, I don't know, to this day, I don't know a lot of music from the 90s or 2000s or any time before, because I wasn't alive before that. I don't know many musicians or music like that normal people would know, especially like pop music, popular music. My family just didn't listen to music a lot. We're not super musical people. So I don't know much about that kind of thing. So in some ways I was sheltered. It's also just not really an interest. It's not that we were told we couldn't listen to music. We just kind of didn't back then. But on the other hand, I would also see myself as, in many ways, much less sheltered than many kids that grew up in only one country, or kids that grew up in only one place for their whole lives and only had one set of friends or one school, because my family did move around a lot and we lived cross-culturally, and we as kids had to learn to build relationships and build community even in a culture that was very different from our own. So I feel like, in the sense of understanding how the world works, understanding how to live cross-culturally, we probably had a lot more knowledge than the typical Michigan farm kid that I was born to be, because my childhood was so varied. We took our homeschool with us. That stayed consistent, but we had many different experiences in our childhood. So in that sense, it was not sheltered. Related to being sheltered, in another sense, I did kind of fit the homeschool stereotype of, I did marry my first boyfriend at 19. So I feel like in that category, I do pretty much squarely fall into the "you're such a homeschooler" category. And 5, the last stereotype is that homeschoolers are super religious. And I would say in this category, I definitely fall into place in this category. I would not say that like we homeschool because of being very, because of faith being the core of our lives necessarily. But that definitely is a huge part of my own life, huge part of my growing up years. We were the family that's sitting around the dinner table arguing over theology, arguing over church history and theologians and scripture, and having all of these very passionate discussions and informed discussions. I've always believed in an informed faith and a studied faith, and in knowing the Word of God. The reason I got started with writing homeschool curriculum was actually just because I had this really big passion to write a curriculum that covered the history of the Bible. Because I'm like, what? People need to know the history of the Bible. Where did we get the Bible? How did we get the English Bible of today? So I wrote a unit study on that. Other people are writing unit studies on, like, oceans and birds and normal things, but I'm like, what we really need is a history of the Bible study so that we can understand where this book came from. How did we get it? What's been the journey and what people have fought for us to have access to this word. So yes, this stereotype does not apply to all homeschoolers, obviously, but for me and my family, faith is a very, very large part of our life. It's a large part of how we interact. It does impact the way I view education, because my view of education is never purely functional. It's never purely essentialism of this is what we have to do to fulfill these requirements, or this is what we have to do to be successful and get a job. My view of education isn't based on that at all. It's actually much more fueled by my faith, which is that God made us and He gave us these minds and He gave us these abilities, and it would be kind of insulting to not use them. If He created us with such amazing minds, with so much capacity to learn, seems like we ought to do our best with what He's given us. It seems like we ought to use these gifts that He's given us to learn what we can and to use that knowledge for good and to use that knowledge in His work in our world. So that is in a way, I don't say that we homeschool out of the religious fear of the outside world, but my faith does heavily influence my whole philosophy behind homeschool and education as to why are we putting so much work into this? Well, it's because I see it as work worth doing. I see it as using the gifts God gave us instead of putting them in a hole and in the ground and covering them up with a shovel. This is my way of putting it in the bank. And this is my view on education, is shaped by this faith and this belief. All right, there's my homeschool stereotypes video. I'd love to hear what stereotypes do or do not fit your family, or what are some other ones that you've heard, and how do you feel about those stereotypes? I'll be seeing you next time. Bye.